All right, so we're going to go pretty quickly through the topics so that we'll have a lot of Q&A time at the end. Yeah, I'm just giving you a heads up. So if I start talking really quickly, feel free to ask your question anytime, but know that we will be having quite a bit of Q&A. All right. So Islandora Enterprise DC Docker Compose. Actually, I had to look this up. I've always just known what ILDC was, but didn't know what it actually stood for until recently. A couple of key points. When you run make up for the first time, if you've never run it before, it'll actually default to demo. So it runs your make local plus demo content. If you ran anything else, it defaults to whatever you had running before. So if you had done make down and turned it off and then wanted to bring it back up to the last state, it'll respect that, and whatever's in your .environment file, it'll read and continue on with. Run the some of the things that it does when it does make up, it runs and all of the make files defaults. It checks to see if docker compose.yaml exists in the root directory. It runs the update settings PHP file, which is a little complicated in my opinion, if you haven't had a chance to look at it. It also runs a little script that's your secrets warning. So we'll touch base a little bit more on secrets in a bit. And from a demo build, so not just local, but from demo, it also runs the makeup function and uses Workbench to do the imports, which wasn't originally the case. We had a little bit of like just a manual database import, and really wasn't that helpful, I thought, to help people get started, because when they wanted to make their own and make it their own, it was really complicated to walk somebody through how to do a database dump after they manually made all these changes. So when you set, if you want to do just your local and not the demo, you can edit your .environment file, or if it doesn't exist, you copy sample.env and to .dmv, just the .env file, and change the line, which is like 7 or 8 lines in, from environment equals demo to you change it to local. And this just runs all the same process as make demo, but without the demo content. And if you looked at the make file, it literally for demo function, it runs make local, and then the very next line is import dummy data. So it's just running this. Now, key items to look for in the make file. There's a lot of them, but there's if you haven't done it before. So if you're going to add to the make file or try to understand what it's doing, if it's a normal command that you would run in Bash, that it's going to mostly work in a make file, but with some little tiny caveats. So the adding shell to the front of your command helps. It will work 99% of the time. Sometimes if it's a shell fragment and that's a pain, you'll see a double $. A function name to look out for if you're like, why is this running every single time I make any command whatsoever? Anything under the default colon function will run every single time. So keep that in mind. If you're trying to figure out where to add something to trigger for a make up, do not add it there, because when you try to do make clean, it'll also do it. So anytime you see a pound at the beginning of a line, it's a comment. And then anytime you see a function name where the previous line is a double pound, that is a comment that's going to show up inside of a help command. So if you intend people to use your function or your staff to use it, and you want it to show up when somebody runs make space help, that's the only time that double pound will work. Otherwise, it's just considered a comment. The hyphen in front of a few commands, like the one I have in this example here, docker compose ... whatever it might be, that means it'll silently, if it fails, it will ignore the failure and keep moving on. Sometimes, like when you do make down or make clean, and there's nothing running, it's trying to kill a service that doesn't run. You don't want it to kill before it finishes deleting files. So just adding that hyphen at the very beginning, no spaces, is all that's happening there. And that's something that's built in. None of these really are anything specific to Islandora. These are all pretty much, except for the double pound. The rest of that's all just kind of Makefile stuff. Structure of a custom function, if you're going to make one, or if you're just reading through and seeing what functions are in that Makefile, you're going to see .phony, .silent, your double pound with your description, the name, the colon, and in that red text there, anything after the name of your function is the things that need to fire before it fires. So you can call another function from this point, or if you put a file name in there, it'll look to see if that file exists. And then the following one with an indent, those are where the actual commands start coming into play, where you're firing. So if you're going to create a foobar function, we have a description now, and the first thing foobar does is clears cache for Drupal. What the .phony means is it's not necessarily, foobar is not necessarily a file. So it's not going to see, or it's not going to look for a file by the name foobar in the root directory. Silent, I'm a little fuzzy on, to be frank. It is, the best description I can give is that, oh God, I actually have notes on it. I should have thought about that. Because I didn't think it was super clear, but inhibits the display. I'm sorry?
No output.
Oh, great.
Yeah. No display on output.
So, yeah. Oh, and when we give out these the slides, I tried to, everything I'm saying here, I put in the comments, so you should be able to pick up on it. These two here aren't absolutely required, phony and silent, and neither is a prerequisite function name, or like whatever function you want to start before you start this. But I thought it would be useful to show, illustrate it. Now, when you run, get back into my, start make command, the make help, there we go. Where did that go? Yeah. You run your make help command. This is the layout, and did a little functionality here to get it to group together the build commands. So make demo, make local, and make up are your three current build commands. Like I was saying before, demo gives you demo content. Local will create the code base, but no demo content. So basically identical setup in a lot of ways. It didn't used to be. The other functions here are the ones that people have suggested as you can run them one off. Not all the functions should you run one off. There's a couple in there that'll probably get you in trouble because it'll start overriding stuff and it's just not going to work. But these are ones that I've ran. Other people have discussed with me and said that they've run. So we put the double pound in front of the description. So these should all work. A couple of ones that are worth mentioning when you're doing backups on a server, you want to do a dump. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel. It's already in here. So you want to pull out or put in your database, your files, either your public files or Fedora files, and re-indexing, triple, I mean, everything that's up there is there. The one that I'll warn you about is the composer update. Yeah, that'll break your site quick. So it's necessary when you're updating your site, but doing make update, you're going to have to do some work sometimes, especially if it's a breaking change on one of those many modules that are going to get updated. So just a caution, just be aware of that. So database dumps, want to know where your actual data is at. It does depend on what kind of platform you're on. If you're on a Mac, it gets complicated where the actual stuff is. So I'm jumping to the bottom comment first, location. Most Linux box machines are going to have that address of where it stores all your volumes. So if you're looking for a way to back up the data in as raw form as possible, you're going to find it under your Docker volumes directory. If you have to do it manually, which is what you might have to do with Macs if you're doing it locally, these make commands are expecting some parameter at the end. So you do make and then Drupal's database dump space and then destination equals and then the file path, and it needs to be an absolute path. So if you tried to do tilde space, tilde / desktop, whatever, it does not work, or at least in my experience, it hasn't. And same thing for the import. Oh, secrets. This one is probably overkill. It's a bash script that runs every time you do like make up, or there's a couple of scenarios, but when you're building it for the first time, it runs twice. When you are bringing it up, it will run. So if you've updated your server, the idea is it's going to give you warnings if you're running defaults. It'll also, like if it doesn't see anything, it's going to give you a couple of offers of like, hey, what do you want to do? Do you want to generate random passwords, or do you want to copy the passwords that are currently in the repo, which is just password? So everything would be set to password. That's not a good idea in most situations, but it's there to show you what the file structure should be, and if you really want to use those files, you can. I mean, we used to just right-click, copy, paste over into the proper directory, and you get all these files, and all these files are just the name of the variable, and then inside the file, the text that's in there is just the word password, and that's your actual password for that particular service. So what the script is doing is going through all of your current passwords for your live site and checking to see if they're still set to the default. And if there are any, because there might, like if something comes up tomorrow, somebody's like, hey, I'm going to put in this new service, or we need to add this new password somewhere, and you update your site, it's going to say, hey, this is missing. So it copies it over for you. And then it's like, hey, you're still using the default password for this new password. You need to change it, and gives you that warning every single time. This way, there's no mistakes. You know, down the road, your system administrator doesn't accidentally maintain a default password on a production environment. You will constantly get that message. It won't block anything, but it will tell you at the very end of the build process, hey, by the way, these are the passwords you need to go back and fix. It does a lot of like checks. It does a lot of, does the copy for you, will generate for you. I do suggest if you're doing makeup for the first time, it'll prompt you, what do you want to do? Option 1 is automatically generate. You do that, you'll never see that error message again until you rebuild. So that was hopefully, there is even a way to bypass that check entirely, and it's in the top comment of that shell script. So if you're ever curious, I tried to document it. It's also in the bash script. Just read it as a text file, and you should be able to very quickly add the, I think it's -y or something like that at the end of the make command. So cutting down, down versus clean. Down is not just Docker compose down. We found that sometimes that causes problems. So there's an extra little, couple of extra, I think this is not verbose, but there's another switch or two that makes it smoother at the shutdown. So when you bring it back up, you don't have any errors from Drupal. So we have that. It's a very simple command, whereas clean, not simple and you could lose quite a bit of work. So make clean will reset pretty much everything, including it'll delete your code base directory, and that's a pain. So be aware that that could happen. Copy your code base out or comment that part of the Makefile out. I don't think it should stay, but I'm not the community. I'm just one voice in it. So if more people are interested in it being removed, I'd back you on it. Yeah, well. There's a yes or no for the initial part. It's like, are you sure you want to do this? But it's for everything though. It's not just deleting that one directory. So, but yeah, I agree. Like maybe a second prompt might be a good idea of like, hey, are you sure you want me to delete the code base directory? But it's a great way to reset and get back to square one, like perfect every time.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry. Yes. Should we add a prompt, a yes or no prompt during the make clean process so that people don't accidentally or at least warn them that they're about to delete their code base directory? And currently there is a yes no prompt, but it's for the entire process and it's not specifically to just the code base directory. So.
One thing about prune, I'll just say from experience, prune, while that was probably effective in your use case, prune in general is an incredibly dangerous command. So like make clean sort of operates in just in the silo of the, wherever you installed your Islandora ISLE setup. But what Alan's talking about, which is a perfectly legit and, very handy command, just know that there's a lot of danger surrounding it. So like what a prune does from a Docker level is to, if just blank system prune, it gets rid of all of your Docker images, it will get rid of all of your Docker volumes. So that's one where, yes, but I would definitely read the manual on learning the nuance with prune, because as Alan points out, there is extra commands that sort of limit the nuclear strike, if you will. And if you don't put some of those flags in there, you could wind up having a bad day. I can speak from experience on that. Which cache? Image cache?
The Docker has a cache of some of the, sometimes when you're building a container. So it's the same image.
Oh, the build cache.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a good question, Alan. Alan was asking, how do you clean Docker build cache? And I'll be honest, off the top of my head, I don't recall, but I will get an answer for you.
That sounds like.
Definitely.
Docker builder prune.
20 points to Nigel.
Prune.
Thank you, Nigel.
Yeah,
Docker builder
you.
prune, putting it in the chat.
I do have I have an alias for nuke Docker, and it wipes everything out. I've come across once in a while that a network will hold itself because of traffic. So I have to delete the network port separately because the system prune doesn't do it, won't touch it. And I've already shared it in the wiki tab. So if you ever go to ILDC GitHub's or GitHub thing, in the wiki tab, I've put a number of, anytime I've come across something repeatedly, I figured somebody else is going to hit it too. So I've added it to the troubleshooting page, and you're welcome to do the same. If you do not need permission, add it there. If you think it's useful for the community, please feel free to add it. But my alias for nuke Docker is very aggressive, wipes out everything, resets your basically resets all of your Docker back to an empty starting point. But the warning I have is if you're working on other projects, it does not care that it's in a different directory or that you had it saved somewhere else. If it's in Docker, it's gone. And the same thing with these system prunes. If those containers are turned off, all that stuff is wiped out. So it's not the best approach if you're doing a lot of different clients or different other Docker tests and stuff, because all that'll get wiped out in the process. But make clean is very specific to this, whereas the Docker commands we're talking about right now is very global. It's your whole system's Docker set of images. So.
And I would also add that these kinds of commands, make clean, I think the context should be given is the assumption when you're doing a lot of Makefile work is on your local laptop. These aren't the kind of commands you really want to be getting in deep on a remote server that's a staging or production server. You really just want to be able to do this on your local, where the penalty for deleting something isn't as high, say. So this would not, just further context, kids, don't do this at home, don't do this on your production server. These are just local commands.
Mm-hmm. This is the tab I'm talking about. It's wiki, and feel free to add. I've done a few in here, so like for production security tips, some of this are just placeholders, but if you see anything that you like filled out, but you don't know how to fill it out, say something, and maybe one of us can step forward and probably start filling in the blanks. I'll BuildKit.
Okay, so BuildKit. So some might be asking, hey, I'm looking through ILD. Within the Docker Compose file, there's all these things called Docker images. Where are those Docker images grown? Where are they harvested? And I am one of the IL BuildKit maintainers. This kind gentleman over here, Nigel Banks, is also, and much credit due to him for building this wonderful system that we use. And maybe a few thoughts on how he put that together. But the beauty is, essentially, we try to, as maintainers, we try to asynchronously discuss through the GitHub issues queue and projects various things that we're going to work on or fix, and try to address some of the community issues. So the idea is that BuildKit in a flowchart sits above ILDC, and it pushes all of the functionality that ILDC needs through the use of Docker images. And part of the advantage of using Docker images is you can think of them as like things frozen in time. The state is set. And the other beauty of the way that IL BuildKit works is as we do various pull requests, as we do various development versions, all of those images are pushed so that people can try any number of things on their locals to see, oh, I see that there was a new release. Should I use this image? And then it gives you a good workflow to be able to test, do I want to upgrade? Nigel, myself, Don, others, we try to keep it on a monthly basis, and we try to respond to issues that the community raise, like I said, in GitHub issues. We really would love your feedback and your input and your help, of course, in any way that you can. And feel free to, there's also what's called a discussions tab, where like if you have questions, comments, concerns, beeps, whatever, come on, we'd love to hear from you. But essentially so let me try to break it into two. BuildKit is obviously, clearly and foremost for ILDC and the community, but it's also a way of us releasing stable releases, things that work. So they're all tested in various ways. But as a user, once you sort of graduate from using ILDC, and let's perhaps say that you want more degree of customization, well, BuildKit's going to be your jam. That's where you're going to go to say, well, maybe I want the Nginx image or timeout settings. So rather than going into what you can sort of do it two ways. You can go into your ILDC and bind mount the heck out of all the config files, but that gets really kind of messy quickly, or you can download or fork IL BuildKit, and you can begin to code on BuildKit and make changes to various services as you see fit, upping or downing all sorts of values And then the beauty is you run BuildKit, it will build these Docker images, and then you can use your own Docker Hub or other image repository, and you can push those images and maintain them yourselves. And then as Nigel and I and others push out new changes, you just pull from that file BuildKit into your fork, and voila, you get all the benefit of the community's work, but while maintaining your very strict order and changes. So we put a couple of links here where you can find things. That like you can look into any of those files that are contained within that folder to sort of see like how does it work. And then maybe in the QA session, again, like I said, for those who are interested in, hey, how do I run BuildKit? There's, I can tell you that there's any number of fabulous READMEs that Nigel has gone to great extent to write out. And it's a wonderful, it's a Gradle system. It has, it's like a robot. I felt like, Nigel, this was the best slide I could use to approximate how complex BuildKit is. But I can say, maybe I'm a little cracked, but I enjoy using it. It's very straightforward. And the release process is usually, a breeze compared to, I'm also the IL7 maintainer. And I can say I really enjoy BuildKit more than IL7. Yeah, so thank you. And and we're always on the lookout for more maintainers. Please come and join. We'd love to have you.
So that is it for the slides. I can, if it will let me. Tabs is my Zoom call. There we go.
One thing that I would like to point out that just as BuildKit is this wonderful Swiss Army knife on customization, folks should really feel like that Makefile can be theirs, because Makefile is essentially like this wonderful cheat sheet of chained functions and commands that allow you, the user, to be able to just sort of speak a kind of pigeon language to be able to make IL jump and dance and do various things. And it's an incredible time saver. So I would really recommend that folks sort of hop into the Makefile and begin to dissect it, because you're more than welcome to make changes to it, and especially give it back to the community for any number of little tiny functions. So it's definitely something that's not written in stone. I can't recall, maybe Nigel can, why we arrived at Make, but I think it's one of the most oldest, most robust kind of things to use as, sort of declarative language or syntax. Yeah, just handy. And it's also pretty standard on all, like practically all servers and laptops and so on. So.
Come across a make command that you don't think would be appropriate to share with the community, and it's very specific to your organization, we put in this line here. So if you create a file called custom.makefile, it will automatically, and as you can see, the first part of this is a hyphen. So if it doesn't see it, it doesn't care, it'll just move on. So it'll include this custom.makefile. You can call from that custom.makefile any function in either file. So you don't have to do any weirdness of like, hey, you got to import burst or something like that. So it's going to import that file as though it's sitting at the top of this file right here. So you create a custom.makefile and then run make help. You will see your function, assuming you put the actual proper comment in before your function name. So that's a heads up on that. That'll also makes it easier for when you're pulling from the community Makefile. If you've been customizing your own Makefile and messing with a couple of the functions that meet your needs, or adding stuff, you might create a conflict. So when you're pulling from upstream, it gets a little complicated. Whereas if you just pipe all your stuff into a custom .makefile, you avoid that nightmare. So yeah, other stuff that would probably be useful. I mean, that was the one thing I wanted to go out of my way to show you, but demo, here's another one. You get your typical phony silent, your description, and then right out the gate, a make command is this, so it's a $sign first, and make is in all caps. That's essential. It runs make local, then make demo content, and make login. And just looking at this, if you just ran make demo content on your site, it would actually do just like this. It would pull in that demo content into your installation. So.
Just repeat the question just really quickly. So if I understood you, Alan, you were saying that in your particular example on your remote servers, you have challenges with DNS, and you're asking, can one overwrite functions in the Makefile? Did I understand you? Okay.
Specifically,
So yes, the answer is totally, and I think the good timing on the question, because I realize that I'm Wade on the chat has some very similar questions, and I'll try to answer both of you at the same time. One of the things we at Born Digital, we use CICD, continuous integration, continuous development. We use GitLab pipelines, and this sort of justifies and really sort of leverages the Makefile as the sort of central point for controlling containers without having to jump into the container, without having to try to change the thing. And one of the points that I made in the chat that I realized probably doesn't exist in the current community edition, but would be the direction that I would point Alan in, and most certainly Wade, as Wade's been asking some questions on the chat with respect to, hey, how would I use a different service in Wade's example, backup? And in Alan's, it's, hey, I have DNS that I need to sort of supply to the container. And in Alan's case, what Alan is saying is containers don't always know or resolve DNS queries. So you're needing to sort of pass a value to a container to say, hey, when you perform a function, understand what this value is. So my answer to both.
Not necessarily because the
Which command?
Kurder. We're trying to find a good example for those online as well.
Hey, I'm sorry. This is Wade. It dropped out right when you're about to say like.
Sorry, Wade. Alan was clarifying a couple of remarks, and I need to be. We're looking for an example.
Okay.
I think it would be great if Alan could come up to the mic. That would probably save a lot of time and effort.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. He's coming.
We will do that. Because Alan's making a good point.
Well, essentially, just to put this all in the nutshell where it belongs, is there are some commands that you don't want to change that much. In fact, I think this may be the one here.
So local, Alan's pointing at.
No, sorry, that's generate secrets. Don't want to mess up your command. Anyway, just it's a command that builds your Drupal site, and it relies on Packagist, and it will fail on my instance, only, I've never seen this on anything except as one HostGator server, because it can't find a DNS. So you have to specifically add one additional flag to the to your command. So you're, can I scroll through here?
Yep. I have a good answer for you either way.
Okay. Well, let's just say, let's imagine it's this one. It's not, but
Okay.
let's imagine it was, and you wanted to stick an extra flag in.
Yeah.
So can I take run Islandora migrations, put my own run Islandora migrations in there that will override that one?
So I think you have three different, to try to answer both of you at the same time. Alan's bringing up a good example where, because this is your own code, you could do option one, which is a little bit repetitive, but you could make your own function, which is a copy of it, rename it, and it could have that extra flag. That's certainly a legit way of doing it. But then you would have to go through the entire file and sort of like anything that was chaining from that original function, you'd
Exactly.
have to redo it. So one way that we get around that at Born Digital is we use an additional file called make.env, which is where you see a lot of the variables called in the Makefile. We sometimes substitute things. And so to your point, Alan, you could add a new variable, and then that way you can just add a new path, a flag, anything. And unfortunately, in some cases with DNS in particular, your better bet might actually not be in the Makefile, but in your Docker Compose file.
Yeah.
Where you should declare a variable there to say, hey, container, you need to understand this interchange of DNS changes. That actually might be the cleaner setup.
In this particular one, nothing that's supposed to work does work. I
Yeah.
went into Daemon JSON. I
Yeah,
added it there. That's supposed to be the bomb-proof one. Didn't work.
right.
So it's overwriting. So typically what I do now is build a container, then exec in and edit etc resolve.conf, which you can't do from outside the container because it's
No.
bound. So it's a running process. We can't
So
touch
that
it.
sounds like you should, my recommendation on that front in particular is to look at traffic and network. And you can use Docker Compose alias, or you can change the traffic label, and that might be able to include that flag for you. Because I think the plumbing that you're looking to alter isn't in the Makefile necessarily. You're having a higher up in the stack kind of issue. And I would definitely look at, again, I'll repeat it. Docker Compose has a thing called alias where you can just set a domain inside a particular container such that you don't have to edit the etc hosts every time. Because that, I agree with you, that doesn't feel right. So you could set it there, or you can set within the traffic labels if the service needs to be accessible to the outside. Just real quick, folks.
Okay, this is it right here.
Yeah.
It's this particular line is I just have to add, specifically throw a DNS in there. So just --DNS colon 8888.
I would handle, if it were me, I would not handle it there.
Okay.
I would treat this as neutral code, and I would look at the Docker Compose, and I'd be happy to look at that with you and
All right.
test it out, because I think it's better managed higher up in the
Higher in the
stack.
chain.
Because
All right.
otherwise, I think what could fail here is, so essentially the interplay between Docker env, which is environmental variables, and the Makefile, which has its own roster of variables, it's like an onion, and you kind of have to start at the center that all containers talk to each other as defined through the Docker Compose, and then you sort of work your way outwards. And so what Alan's bringing up a fine, really good example that I myself also struggle with sometimes when I'm in certain server environments is where you need to be able to pass a domain and say, hi, I'm blah blah.edu or .com, but the container says, I don't know who you are because I'm way down in this Docker network and I'm only talking to other services by name. I have no idea what a domain is. And so I'm recommending to him that, okay, let's pick which concentric circle or onion, part of the onion that we're in. And I'm suggesting when you want to adjust things in a network, your two stops are always traffic itself, which is the proxy that basically allows all the containers to talk to the internet, to the server, to anything outside of its own service, or Docker Compose. Just, that was a great question. And Wayne, to also answer your question, Makefiles are going to be your central point to be able to make containers produce various files like backup of the DBs. And in your case, my recommendation would be that you use Drupal backup and migrate, and potentially you use a backup agent to point at the public or excuse me, private files path and take snapshots of that. And that would probably be the fastest, most clean way of being able to back up databases.
Now,
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Now, there's a quick and dirty way of doing stuff that I think I was going to mention that for Alan's situation, where if he just wanted to, under the circumstances, there's a better solution. But if I were a developer and I needed a quick, dirty solution, but I didn't want to edit my this file here, if I literally copy this, create a new file, custom.makefile. Up, where is it? Yep.
Where Don is going is definitely also a very valid and fine solution, which is essentially you make multiple makefiles and you call it in different ways. And that's a great way of being able to say, hey, when I'm in this local, in this setting, I want to run just this makefile with these, these commands. Server, I also want to use the same makefile, but it's this server test staging prod. So that's also a way of having your cake and eating it too, where you don't want to have to remember the nuances of a variable or muck about with traffic. What Don's proposing is also another way to get around this without feeling like, again, you have to go in, duplicate everything, figure out the intricacies of what has changed. No, you can just go ahead, make your own custom makefile, give it all the functions and changes and nuances you want, keep everything clean.
So if you do just local, I don't know the behavior, like the behavior didn't seem consistent to me. I'm not sure which, so you'll have a naming conflict. So find a naming convention that works best for you if you're going to do a copy of something that already exists. But this will work because this is just more code that's embedded at the top. It's not an order of operation. It will call whatever, just there's no magic that you need to do to make this work. But this is the quick and dirty way. It's super helpful. I use it a lot. And it's a great way to test without having to modify the local and then remember whether or not you actually edited it.
And that's where that make env file can also be helpful, which is an additional environmental variable. You can sort of say, call this makefile, not that makefile. We also use make env to change around data paths. So I'll just point out, not as a critique, just as a difference. The current ILDC doesn't really have any thinking yet around, okay, I'm a local versus I'm a remote. And when I say remote, I mean production server, staging server, something that is not your laptop, essentially. And so what we do at Born Digital is we use a make env file to essentially change various images. We control things through CICD pipelines, and we leverage the make file heavily. But as you can well imagine, that's like multiple environments, locals, servers, and then the GitLab pipeline itself as its own sort of ethereal presence. And so we have to have a way of being able to sort of jump in and out of each state and each environment each time without getting mixed up about, well, which variable are we using? Which system am I calling?
I point out, your make environment file you're talking about is separate than the one that's in this.
Yes. Yeah, we have as a result, we have modified the make file. And when we find something that works really well for the community, typically we try to give that back as a way of, I will say that Makefiles, like even the current community edition, I think, as I was saying to Don and others this morning, if there is a upcoming documentation sprint, or even just a sprint in general, I would really encourage folks to, pick this apart and begin to sort of create some of the like better cheat sheets. Because I think, as Don, I think, did a really good job of sort of carefully pointing out, you really need to know what you're calling, because just because you say make something, it's not necessarily the embodiment of just one command. It's usually a chained command. And that's also the sort of, I was getting the inferred warning about Don's going through the custom Makefile. If you repeat functions, you really need to know what that function is that you're repeating, because it may not jibe with the context you're trying to provide. So just, beware of what you're copying, because it could have downstream effects. And to which someone in this crowd would probably very naturally ask, well, how do I know what I'm running? And I say, hey, that's a great point, because after a certain point, this gets super unwieldy. Like if you look at the Makefile, if you look at our company Makefiles, it's like, oh my God, there be dragons everywhere. What part of the map am I on? And I think, some plucky, intrepid spirit should like really take this on as an issue and sort of begin to map out a little bit of, as I think Don did a great job in the slides, which is, what's the most salient? If I'm starting out, what do I really need to know? I don't need to know all of those other things, and begin to break the Makefile up in such a way that like various folks who are, wherever the point in their journey are, this is a critical file that they need to learn how to use, and that it's friendly. And right now, I think it's just been a lot of us vets who are just going in and just, plopping things without context. And I think it's matured enough that we should try to clean it up.
Another key thing that's worth mentioning, I didn't put to the slides, but I think is absolutely essential now that we're talking about environment files. If there's, in the .environment file, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of things in here. There's some things, a couple of things I think probably shouldn't be here. So exposing Fedora, if you set it to false, it doesn't work. So it probably shouldn't be in there. But if there's anything that like expose MySQL, or expose BlazeGraph, you make a change to this environment file, that doesn't do anything to your servers. You have to run the make environment or make env, and it'll refresh your Docker Compose file and pull all those changes in, and suddenly you can now get to Solar's dashboard or whatever you set to be exposed. So if it says expose underscore and then the name, that is literally exposing it through Docker to your local host. So you should be able to get to it by whatever URL is specified with. It's not super clear, and it's not intuitive in my opinion. And I was the one that made it, made the make command for it, so I understand. And that brings me to the other things. If you come across something like that and it's not intuitive, make a suggestion, because it was desperation that I put it in. And you might have a better approach of like how we could be wording this, or how, a different name for it even, that it makes more sense, and it just never was brought to the table. So feel free to make comments or even put in the pull request to make it happen. Don't be shy about it.
I would second that, especially towards BuildKit. There's a lot of features that still haven't been sort of released, and Nigel, myself, Don, and others who work on that, we're only as good as the community's feedback. And so half the time we sort of pull examples from our experience and say, okay, this would really work nicely for, say, sysadmin. And we leave it at that. We don't always necessarily develop for every edge case, but we try to make an educated guess around the needs of our community. That having been said, once that's said, we don't attempt to speak for the community. So like, we'd really love to have more people who come in and say, no, actually, I need the ability to change anything from PHP to log file levels, or, I'm throwing out some things that I'm fairly confident Nigel and others have fixed, but we're only as good as your feedback. One other piece of warning, which is with respect to BuildKit, my recommendation is how do I know when I'm ready to do this is if you feel like you really know the play of how ILDC works, meaning you know where to go, how to debug something between Docker Compose, Makefile, and the other configs, then I would recommend moving on to BuildKit. Because otherwise it is a completely sort of deconstructed view of all of that affair. And you really kind of have to know the interplay between all of the microservices in Drupal, which isn't to say that it's for the faint of heart, quite the opposite. I just don't want people to jump into BuildKit thinking, hey, I can just customize everything, get super frustrated and not sort of understand the connection. That's where, again, I would also recommend you hop on to the IL channel. Maybe we can make a BuildKit channel and start asking questions. I don't even think we have a BuildKit channel, so maybe we should make one. Seth, go ahead.
Appreciate the fact that there's a Drupal one.
Sure.
I've used that, but it's not intuitive for some of us who are new to the whole Docker environment. Where do I go to get that similar code directory for Crayfish so I can, build a new derivative service or something like that?
Nigel, do you have any thoughts on that?
Not too bad. So I believe there's like a docker compose.user.xml file that you can just like add to the folder, and it's like not part of the repository, like the Git repository, and then you can just throw in whatever Docker Compose stuff you want. So you can select the existing service, say for like Omaris or what have you, and then for the volumes section in the YAML, you can say, okay, bind this folder to that folder, so then it's your code being in it. If you want to use like the IDE, like doing the editing stuff, take a look at the existing Docker Compose files for the IDE and for Drupal. So the way it basically works is the Drupal container exposes a volume from what's inside of it out, and then the IDE consumes that mount point in itself and just pretends to be Drupal because it has PHP and all the other stuff it needs to run. And then essentially you remove the tags from the Drupal container for traffic to route traffic to Drupal, and instead point it towards, just copy them into the IDE one. And then all the traffic that would normally go to Drupal goes to the IDE. And from the IDE's perspective, it's just like, hey, I am Drupal and I can accept breakpoints and stuff, and I know what the code is and what have you. So I believe that's how it works in there. Yeah. If you want sort of like a really stripped down example, like the talk that we gave, there's the repository that was linked in that talk is just like a single Docker Compose file that does like that, but only for the Drupal install. So it's like a lot less code to look at than ILDC, but it's like, it's not meant to be like a starting point project, but it's like maybe an easier gradient into understanding like all the services that are there and like where the mount points and stuff like that.
To turn that feature on, theoretically, is in the doc environment file, specifically code. What is it? There, it was working for a while. I do think that it is currently broken. I know.
Oh, okay.
Alan mentioned that during one of the meetings.
Service right there.
Which one?
You just scroll past it.
Code server. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I guess it might depend on the version, because there's a bug there for a while. It's not interesting. But anyways.
We'll be looking at that tonight. It's the code service itself is a really handy thing for basically it's a little bit of inside Docker baseball, but the idea is the beauty of Nigel having included this in this whole stack is if you don't want to use bind mounts, Docker bind mounts, which are typically a source of a lot of stress because and what that is it exposes files and folders that are within a container to the host system, whether that be your laptop or server. Now, the nature, sorry?
The other way around, so it's from the host into the container.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And so what happens there is there's always a sort of clash of permissions. And a lot of Docker purists want you to never bind mount, even though a volume is a form of a bind mount, but at least it's this idea that, hey, Docker handles all. And what Nigel has proposed by introducing this is, hey, we have a really nice way of respecting that It allows better performance. It allows a user to be sort of devoid of all of those challenges. And it allows for more real-time updates of Drupal code or whatever you might be editing. So there's a real advantage. And I know that Nigel, myself, Don, and others, we will be taking a look at it and making sure that feature works.
There's chat questions.
Chat question. Okay, so one of the questions is, can you expand on, thank you, Nigel. Is system requirements beyond what we see here? What are the recommended system requirements as far as CPU, RAM, storage, flavor of disk? Yeah, thank you, Carrie. That is a fine and dandy. I think Wade, if I could extrapolate it a little bit, I think Wade's probably asking for the real world example. And I can say that your typical bet from what I have experienced is if you're running like a staging server, you probably want between 8 and 16 gigs of RAM. For a production server, anywhere from 16 to 32, especially if you're doing large scale ingest. CPU, anywhere from 2 to 4 cores, but hey, as many cores as you can throw at that. And please also note, Wade, you can edit your Docker Compose to allow for containers to use more CPU or memory, like especially the Java apps. For one site or multiple Rebel asks, I think this is just, I'm trying to give generic. So yeah, I think one site typically. But for multiple, I would just like add 2 gigs for every site for RAM, sort of like a multiple of 2. Or flavor of disk, that's pretty subjective. ext4 is fine, but I'm sure there are other sysadmins who find that different file formats work for them.
Well, sorry, when I say flavor of disk, I'm talking about like nearline or SSD, like does you know.
Oh, SSD for sure. I mean, that's the future.
Yeah, we figured as much, but yeah. Okay, thank you.
Depend also on what services you run. So
Exactly.
like if you drop off a bunch of the Java-based services like Fedora, BlazeGraph, really like dramatically shrink the amount of memory that it takes. I mean, I was able to get a server running with just like 8 gigabytes of RAM, but it didn't run Fedora, it didn't run BlazeGraph, and it didn't run Bits. Like all those things 3 combined, like at their base level, like not doing anything, consume like 6 or 7 gigs. So
to flip exactly what Nigel said, on the other hand, don't go, rule of thumb, no matter what environment, don't ever go lower than 8 gigs. You're just like punching yourself in the face at that point. Like you're in for a bad time, don't do it. And then in terms of like, well, how much, like how far? Well, that's up to you. How much resource do you want? Like if you want this thing to move really fast, then yeah, I've dealt with servers that have, 16 cores and 128 gigs of RAM. Like that's not out of sight.
yeah. And
the question is, what should we separate to another server? I don't, should is a strong word. I don't think anyone's saying you should, but I can say that what you can do is you can absolutely decouple ISLE as an architecture, as Nigel was pointing out. Starting with a database, that's a fine example. Some folks, they take the database out of the equation. They don't run that in a containerized version. They run a separate server. That's a prime example. Other folks go so far as to breaking up many of the other services. You don't always have to run these services on a server. You can use things like Fargate and EKS. ISLE's running in Kubernetes. So there's the architecture of ISLE is, I think, to infer from what Nigel was saying, is really about decoupleization. Like the microservices are king on ISLE, and being able to pull this whole thing apart, is its strength.
yeah, definitely like these people running with all sorts of different tools for orchestration. How you pull that.
Well, you can run it, I mean, with orchestration, I guess, is
Like
you can
EKS or
Yeah.
whatever.
Swarm.
Kubernetes. Yeah, you can run it on whatever, because they're just Docker containers at the end of the day. There's a good thing here. I should mention actually this. All the containers that we produce from BuildKit are good for x86 and ARM architecture, so
Yes.
Arch 64. So you can run them on M1s, you can run them on the AWS
Graviton, yep.
Graviton, yeah. So that's like 40% cheaper. So
Yes. And with GP3 SSD, it's even cheaper.
yeah. Someone mentioned disk speeds. I found like in deploying things on AWS, like EBS volumes are generally like really slow. You can get provisioned IOPS, but it's like super expensive. If you can, just push the files out to like S3. So it's much. Which, if you're on AWS.
So we have a question from Annie. Nigel, why don't you sit?
I can read.
Okay, so can you run more than one Drupal container with a single set of the other containers? I've been able to run one traffic in multiple island projects. Yes, Annie's pointing out another great way of doing things, which is the key, traffic being the proxy that controls all the communication from the container, Docker container networks and services as described in Docker Compose to the outside world. And the outside world can be your laptop, it can be the internet, it can be other systems. And absolutely, fundamentally, yes, is the answer and would be encouraged. I know that some folks use Drupal multi-sites in this manner, meaning they have more than one Drupal container that has a site on it. There's any number of ways that you can do that. Some folks like to double up on the microservices so that they have more containers running the ability to create derivatives. Absolutely, that's one of the finest aspects of ISLE in that it's really designed to scale. So the idea being that you could have one Drupal site, but ad infinitum of microservice sites that would just really begin to cut down on the time it takes to create derivatives. So absolutely. Which one?
Turn off, set defaults.
Why don't you speak to that? Because that.
So yeah, there's part of the .environment file that's anticipating this desire. So include traffic service would set defaults, I believe, when you build up your second one. I personally have not done this and tested this, so I am not sure. Yeah, great. So. Alan had mentioned that he has that, and it does work.
Gail has a good question. Are there simple examples of Docker Compose out there for either Drupal multi-site or multiple Drupal containers sharing services? I think in this repo, in the basic ILDC, the answer is no, but that sure would be a handy addition. Maybe that's something we should have considered in our.
Like two things, yes. With the simpler repo for the development project, it's just one Docker Compose, so you'll have an easier time maybe cracking out that. So the way that the multi-sites in a single container works, if you go to the BuildKit documentation for the Drupal container, it'll say something along the lines of Drupal site _ whatever your name is. So by default, the default one is populated for default. And then for every other additional site you want to add, you just use more environment variables to declare those sites, and they'll get spun up for you automatically. If you want to run multiple Drupal containers that are each individual running Drupals, you could just copy the service definition for Drupal in the Docker Compose file, give it a slightly different name, and then you just need to update the traffic labels so that it's a unique service, so that traffic knows to route requests going to that specific host name to that particular container. And you can actually run multiples of the same container as well if you want to do load balancing. So say you had 2 servers and you want to run Drupal on both of them because you have like tremendous amounts of traffic, you could then do that as well, because essentially you're just running the same thing on both. You'd have a load balancer on front. So the amount of different configurations you can do is all sorts of stuff you can do.
Okay,
Hi, I just want to say one thing on behalf of the long-term Drupal community. We own the name multi-site. It doesn't apply to multiple you need another name for multiple containers. I mean, what Nigel just described is multi-site, where you have multiple sites in the same Drupal instance. I think it'd get very confusing if you start using that for something else.
Yeah, we'll just call it multiple Drupal containers then.
Sure. A question from Brian Brown. I have an answer, and I think Nigel probably can speak to this from experience, but I'll repeat it for everybody. Are there any known gotchas with ISLE2 if you plan to ignore all of the Docker Compose and Makefile stuff and run the containers directly in a distributed system like ECS? Two things that I can say are price and which orchestration tool. But Nigel might have more depth on that.
ECS is free, which is great. The bad thing is you get tied into it because it's all AWS specific. So anything you do for that, you can't really move around side. And so you're going to have to learn the weird, odd things around that. Work well for you, because then you don't have to pay like for a control plane like you have with Kubernetes. Like if you went with the hosted option EKS and AWS, I think it's like $150 for their cheapest control plane per month. Yeah, so you can just avoid that. But you got to learn some stuff, and then you're stuck there. And if you want to move, you got to learn whatever you move to after. So it's a trade-off.
I've seen some challenges with price in that, like, depending, Amazon has some pretty opaque opinions about what constitutes how long a container runs and for what. And sometimes you can run up a bill pretty quickly on something you thought was just sitting there idle. Because the default, taking a step back, Docker as an architecture is a run once kind of architecture. And we're sort of like ISLE in itself is a bit of a bastardization in the sense that we have containers on all the time and they sit there idle, whether they are trying to do a function or not. And sometimes that comes in conflict with a orchestration tool like ECS, where it says, oh, I'm just expecting this container is going to drop off, or I can spin up multiple.
Oh, no, generally they're meant to run forever, or, you know, they have distinctions for that in their API when you're talking about them. But like in terms of pricing, I think they do like per 30 seconds. So if you ran it for 10 seconds, you got to pay for 30, something like that. I can't quite remember. And that's like with Fargate, which, you know, just runs containers for you. You don't have to manage an actual server. You can set up an EC2 server and then have them run on that instead, but the configuration is different. And you can do a mix of both as well. If you want to do automatic scaling for derivative generation, you can do that in Fargate. So it would like check the queue length. If the queue length is very long, spin up a bunch of containers in Fargate to like eat through that as fast as possible. And then the rest of the time just don't, so you don't end up paying millions of months.
We took a long look at Fargate and saw no upside to running it, especially in terms of money.
Yeah, a lot of testing is needed. I will say that various cloud services, especially Amazon, as I affectionately call it, the house of Bezos, they're very opaque about what their pricing is. And in fact, they want you to sort of try a sample for free, and then whammo, you get hit with the bill. So my recommendation is don't just hop into EKS or ECAS on your production server the first day, because you could be, you know, you could blow your budget in a matter of minutes. It's best to sort of work your way up from your local to a remote environment that's a server running Docker, and then getting into some of the, you know, the more area or high altitude kinds of orchestration services like EKS and ECS, because their pricing models, their usage are radically different, as Nigel was explaining, than what a standard server will do for you. Yes, Beatrice.
Yeah, and don't.
Carrie, one moment, please.
Sorry.
Hold on a second.
I'm sorry, Beatrice, could you say that again, please?
If you have recommendations, other AWS or...
Oh, sure. So the question is, are there any recommendations for other hosting types other than Amazon? And I would say, yeah. The good news is Amazon is not the only cloud service out there. Google services are quite good. My personal bias with Google is consummate hipster kind of company. They introduce something that everybody likes, and they said, hey, do you want season 2? And everyone nods their head and they go, nope, forget about it. And they pull back the feature. And it turns out they're sort of renowned for canceling things. So your mileage may vary. Microsoft Azure has also made great inroads on cloud services for a lot of the basic setups, and I would strongly recommend them because they also have, they're trying to be a better community member, especially in Linux, and they're trying to, reform their image. And they seem to also have a lot of offers for educational institutions. And they're actually becoming a much more mature, serious partner in the hosting space. I would strongly suggest you stay away from practically anything else. Like DigitalOcean is fine, but they don't have the same kind of mature products. SoftLayer, unless you're like a governmental institution, perhaps others on the call can speak to that, but you have a good trifecta of services. I will only point out that most of the costs, you're not going to get a wild derivation in price. They're pretty similar. And as Nigel was pointing out, beware of vendor lock-in. So to some extent, whether you jump from Amazon or Google or whoever, you're going to have to kind of pick up on the lingua franca of what their control planes are or what their dashboards are, and that's time and investment.
There's also an extra level with Pantheon. They have a whole coding system where they do the deployments. So it's an extra layer on top of the complexity I've experienced. Although I have actually had quite a bit of luck with Linode as a hosting platform. I have a single gist that will spin up the whole server and even ask you what domain you wanted to set it to, and it will automate the whole process as a way to demo. So I don't know if I would use it as production. I don't know. I haven't tested them that well, but I've used it as a demo. Linode.
I have a question on chat that I think, sorry Wade, this is incredibly specific and I think is outside of the stack. I will try to say, substitute IL 2.0 with just Docker containers. I think you're asking a question that is probably better answered by how does a Docker container work independent of the software that Docker container is running? Because that's not an IL 2.0 specific question. That's more of a Docker, like how does Docker container run on vSphere or a VM, and what's the interaction?
Yeah, I hear you. So, yeah, I had to ask.
Yeah, no, always ask, but I think it's kind of beyond the scope of what we're able to cover here.
I'll throw out something really quick.
Nigel's got it though.
Well, no, not specifically to this question, but just sort of a general sort of thing. So like Docker, it seems like this big thing and it's like a separate idea and all this stuff, but really it's just a process running on a Linux box. It's just namespace so that from its point of view, it doesn't see the other things running on the box. It has a separate virtualized network, so it doesn't see the other things communicating in the network. Think of it as just an isolated process running on it. So it's really dictated by your kernel version for Linux. So once it became 1.0 for Docker, I think it was kernel 3.10 or something like that from Linux. So anything beyond that can run Docker. There's a library that ties into that, like libc, or not libc, but librunc. I think it's it for run container. That's pretty much all that it needs. So
so just a big hefty box.
With a relatively modern Linux kernel, you can run Docker. So if it's in a VM, if it's on bare metal, if it's
it's gonna be easy.
If it's a toaster that runs Linux, it can probably also run Docker.
Which naturally probably invites the question, why Docker? And why do we at the head of this room seem to prefer to use Islandora in ISLE? And the answer is because we keep going back to three things. One is the microservices and this idea of an architecture around Drupal as sort of the head of the Hydra, and then the rest of the services. And we want to be able to, like an accordion, collapse and expand the amount of services that respond to that Drupal head at any given time. So the idea is maybe a developer in his home office, or his or her home office, wants to just be able to do a certain level of development. And then when we get onto a server, we really want to let that puppy fly. We really want to give it as much juice as possible because perhaps there's ingest. And this architecture behind ISLE, especially ISLE 2.0, allows it to scale immensely, whether it's a single server, ECS, Kubernetes, and so on. And that's really more of a reflection of the paradigm shift in the software industry itself, which is about scale. The other is this idea, excuse me, around Cool. Well, just the Docker doesn't use as much resource. So the idea is when we're building from bare metal, while you do get more power, you get more waste. And the idea with Docker is that you can essentially create this expansive network, this expansive interplay between services, but it only takes a very tiny amount of resource from a particular hosting platform. And lastly, the portability of it, such that when you're working in teams and you're making changes that could impact large institutions, the code that's on Nigel's system very easily is portable to mine without the fanfare, as we all know, of earlier Islandora, where you set it up on a Vagrant box or a VM, and it's like, oh my God. The whole idea, the other paradigm shift here is that infrastructure is code. We not only are defining what the code state of Drupal is and the code state, behind the database, but we're actually defining the scaffolding, which is the process of putting this entire environment together as code too, and the interplay between it. And that has made the sharing of ideas and the development of these institutions, repositories, just faster and more efficient and less mistake prone. So that's the why of it. Why go to Docker? Why go to IL2?
Read in the chat.
Yeah, what Yamil's describing is the Jaws scene where Robert Shaw pulls out the tiger shark and Richard Dreyfuss shows his broken heart. I mean, that for those of us who've been working in Islandora, Islandora is an amazing, it's not just a Drupal module, it's a platform, it's a suite, it's an ecosystem. It's like coral. There are so many things that live under the umbrella of what constitutes Islandora. And I think at last count, there were like 80 packages, or, it's well into the triple digits of the amount of libraries and things that you can call and bolt into it. And so Docker Compose, Makefile, Gradle, all of the suite of tools that we use to organize it has really made it such that we have pretty much matured to a standard. And I can say, as someone who joined this community in 2015, like Emil, I also I see that arc. Now I'm not a Drupal developer. I'm not in the forefront of what many of you do, but I'm on the other side, which is the DevOps side, where I'm typically asked to put it all together. And so for me, it's been a fascinating journey, like Emil, like others, that we've finally, in my opinion, we've gotten to a point where we have so many good standards in place that the fun of this whole affair is like, which tool do we get to use and how many things can we plug Islandora into?
Well, thank you for that.
Okay, so I'll repeat the question. So when you're running ILDC in production, how do you go about backing up your data? Well, I'll try to answer this as neutrally as possible. It depends. I mean, it really, the top level things that I would always try to work towards are, I would try to architect your ILDC presence on a server and try to break out where does the code go, where does the data go, and then work from there. And typically, what we do at Born Digital is we break out all of the data in make env files so that it's on a separate disk. For sysadmins like Wade and others, they would be able to find that data very quickly. Because as you know, from Islandora and IL7, and even now, it's that like triangulation between the Drupal site, the database, the Fedora data, and you got to make sure everything sort of like aligns in almost like a triangle, and then you can. So you have to have. I would recommend you use Drupal backup and migrate. Use the Makefile function; it calls into that often. So set up a cron job to make sure that your Drupal BAM is constantly nightly, daily, weekly, hourly backups. You can never be too aggressive with that. I'd also recommend offsite locations for your files directory and your DB. Again, Drupal backup and migrate is your friend. You can do any number of rsyncs to other locations. For your Fedora data, work with your IT administrator, like Wade here, who would be able to do a snapshot of that path or rsync or any number of things that would allow you to, what you're really looking for, again, through timestamps and naming convention, is that perfect correlation of, okay, when I say backup, what I mean is the Fedora data, the Drupal files, the Drupal that goes into what is the state of your Islandora or Isle setup.
No,
If you-
I was going to mention it.
Please.
Now, if we're talking about your local development environment, because currently you do something and you hit make clean, all your code's gone, which is a real pain. So I'd start, if we're going to go take it simply first, is make sure you update your .getignore file to not include your code base directory, and know how to do your config dump before you do anything else. So like before you bring it down, so make config export, and then the commands that we had showed earlier in the slides of like how to dump your database, how to dump your files, your Fedora, whatnot, and get those off your system. I wanted to mention that because there's two sides of this where how you work locally is not how you work in a production environment, and knowing the two, it needs to be stated.
Don brings up a really good point, and I'm showing my bias, and I apologize, which is I was already sort of galloping ahead, assuming everyone understood that your Drupal code should be in a Git repository or software version control, and I appreciate you bringing that up. That would be also one of the first steps you make. One other thing in the spirit of Alan's talk, which is get everyone at the table. One thing that I have really noticed that works really well when you're planning out and taking on Isle in particular, make sure everyone has a voice. Work with your sysadmin folks, work with your metadata consultants, work with your migration folks, like whatever your team is, make sure everyone knows each other and knows what they're getting into. Your sysadmin may or may not be interested in the ins and outs of Docker, but they want to be able to do their job and say, am I giving you a stable hosting environment? Can I rely on you to make sure that things don't go, kerblooey? And sort of,
No. Sysadmins, we definitely need to learn more about Docker.
oh, sure, yeah, perhaps, but I mean, I'm giving those sysadmins who, like most sysadmins, are so, like, every day, it might be Tuesday for you, but it's a 3-alarm fire for us. And so, like, what I'm saying is that, like, by giving people a voice, you give them the chance to say, I may not be able to absorb Docker at the moment, but I do have this plan to, we're going to get our team around that and give the chance that everybody sometimes, I'm just sharing from experience, Wade, that sometimes when Born Digital comes into an institution, sometimes sysadmins feel very like bushwhacked. They feel like they're on edge, they're defensive because it's a technology that they can't prove or aren't sort of accustomed to, and they feel that stress of, oh God, I'm responsible for something I don't know about, and it becomes a black box. And that's not Isle's fault, that's not anyone's fault, that's just, as we know, we're in the tech sector and things move rapidly, and sometimes some institutions aren't prepared for that.
Yeah, new technology, and we understand like what why this is more efficient, right?
Definitely. So anyway, the point is just echoing what Alan was talking about in the earlier talk, which is align yourselves well and make sure everyone understands their roles, because far often, like when just speaking from my experience, I work with an institution, and sometimes we have folks who are ready for this change, and sometimes we don't. But always at the end of the project, everyone's aligned and sees the benefit, as Wade is saying. Where they see, oh, I'm saving so much time because I can run all these make functions. And the sysadmins are happy because they're like, oh, I totally understand how to hook in my backup agent, and I can get all this reporting, and I can see the logging. Everyone begins to see the value in it, and they see the role in it. And more importantly, I come from a world of what's called DevOps. I sit between sysadmins and developers, and my job is almost like making sure that everyone has what they need. And to me, that's the future, where there's no silos. It's just colleagues. It's a lot. It's a big investment, and it can be a paradigm shift that not everyone is ready for, but the future's coming. Not evenly distributed.
So we're at time. I did want to show one set of commands real quick that gets me out of trouble, that I think might get you out of trouble. Somebody mentioned it earlier that their stack didn't work after it blew up. If it does, make clean is usually where I default to, but it's very destructive. You hit yes. You're going to have to reset. It resets permissions, deletes a bunch of stuff. Make sure it does actually mention that it deleted your .environment file. Sometimes I find that get checkout either asterisk or dot, depending on your operating system. You can use both, it doesn't matter. Sometimes that actually helps to finish resetting it. Just, I'm not sure why, but especially once you get your code base directory in, permissions change. If you know a good state, you get checkout asterisk, it just checks out to the last commit you had. You don't even have to push that commit. It's whatever you've committed. And it's kind of like your little reset. And then when you run your makeup, you should be fine. Helps if I type. And this is the prompt you'll get, is the 3 options. So if it looks like that, then it should be fine. This first step is really takes forever, especially on this network. Afterwards, it's this quick. It should only take a few seconds, and then we're right into building. That was it. That was all I needed to. I wanted to make sure that everybody was on page. And again, most of this I have documented in the wiki under troubleshooting. So, and feel free to come to either of us afterwards if you have any questions. There's a number of people in here that I would consider more of an expert than me.
Sorry.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.